it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ms. ABD Emily Butler. She's a great friend of the Institute. She's been plotting with us for a while now. She's also a friend of Lucy Adamski, our alumna, who is now a PhD candidate like herself at Catholic University. We don't have a PhD program yet. We have an illegal underground PhD program. We always invite anybody who's interested to work with us on things politically incorrect. Many people are enchanted by the process, including enchanting people with enormous brains like Miss Butler. She has a BA in classics from Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. She's packing some intellectual heat, and she's in the doctoral program in political theory with a minor field in world politics at Catholic University here. Her primary research interests include Western intellectual history, epistemology, and the relationship between popular culture and politics. But as impressive as it all sounds, her forte is being grounded in the classics, so she's absolutely uncorrupted. She is a paradigm of classical learning, and she applies that to current issues too. Oh, by the way, before I welcome Ms. Butler, I just saw Mrs. Romerstein hiding in the back, Professor Herb Romerstein's widow. And he was another formidable presence at the Institute. He also passed away. We are plagued by a series of departures of people that I don't like to see go. I have a long list of people I'd like to see go, but they are not on my list. So I must be screwing up and not praying properly. At any rate, thank you so much. Mrs. Romerstein Pat's here with us too. And without much more ado, I'd like to invite Emily to tell us all about the Bolsheviks and their women. The female dialectical poem.
Thank you. It's an honor. The Bolshevik treatment of women served primarily the cause of revolutionary power. The Communist Party, demanding of its female subjects first free love and then heroic work as mothers and breeders of a new Soviet man, reflected a devious enslavement of the woman and her subordination to the aims of the Red rulers. From the inception of Soviet Russia, the communist policy vis-a-vis women was aimed solely at the consolidation of a single-party state and the establishment of a new revolutionary world order. The Kremlin's treatment of women, although invariably cloaked with progressive propaganda of women's emancipation, was utterly and ruthlessly subordinated to the revolutionary strategy and tactics of the Bolshevik Party. Women were pawns in a scheme to destroy traditional society and build a radically different one constructed by the party from above. Additionally, Soviet woman was an artificial construct that violated all natural, traditional, and even mainstream progressive notions of womanhood. It denied the necessary autonomy of both an emancipated or traditional female by shackling her rigidly into the Bolshevik Party's dialectical ride to the chiliastic end of history. Most scholars agree that the outcomes of the Soviet attempts to liberate women were devastating, leaving women in even more vulnerable and oppressed positions than before. Some scholars lament that the Soviets did not do more for women in politics, the workforce, and in family life. Other scholars argue that the manifest incongruence between their progressive policies and the actual outcomes was due to either an aberration from true communism or to the recalcitrance of the so-called backward segments of Soviet society, like the peasants, and in the case of Central Asia, the Muslims. This conventional narrative about the emancipation of women under the Soviet Union is at best naive and at worst ideologically driven by scholarship that confuses to acknowledge the unpleasant facts of history. It's still, to this day, heavily colored by the communist propaganda that first masked the movement's true goals in the 1920s. Part of this scholarly undertaking is, of course, to set the historical record straight and lay bare the true intentions of the Soviets vis-a-vis women. But that is not the sole intent. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does reveal certain unchanging tendencies in human nature and politics. By understanding the Soviet project, especially with regard to the particular aspect, this particular aspect which reveals the true heart of its ideology, we can hope to develop the historical awareness needed to properly evaluate present and future political norms. Such an historical consciousness, tethered to human reality, enables us to determine what might be accomplished in politics and what is simply outside of the realm of what is humanly possible. The type of imagination that motivated the communists and other revolutionaries throughout history is one that is undisciplined to the facts. It dreams of a world in which abstractions like freedom and equality are the order of the day. It does not consider what these words will come to mean in the concrete or how they might be realistically accomplished. As we will see, when political action is motivated by such a romantic imagination, the result is calamitous. Plato was perhaps the first prominent political thinker with an imagination of this type. He envisioned a utopia that would come about through total unity among the citizens, with wives held in common and children reared collectively by the state. Beginning in the 2nd century AD, various millenarian religious sects arose. Among the defining characteristics of these groups were eschatological expectations that found expression in an insatiable desire for worldly power and libertinism, often with pronounced sexual overtones. The leaders of these various movements often appealed to persons of society who felt oppressed or otherwise unequal to those with the advantages of wealth, birth, and education. False messiah figures tended to flourish among the poor and oppressed whose traditional way of life had broken down, often during unstable political times. Some notable examples of these millenarian sects of the Middle Ages include the Brethren of the Free Spirit, the Euchites, the Sufis, and the Taborites. In the wake of the Reformation, there was an outbreak of sectarian Chiliasm in Germany. In the name of equality and brotherhood and communion with the divine, these groups called for the abolition of private property, free love, and the communality of women. Common to all of these groups was the belief that they had arrived at the knowledge heretofore inaccessible to man for how to bring about paradise on earth, eliminating worldly evils of suffering and even death. However, the path to paradise would necessarily be a bloody one. First, the world must be cleansed of sinners. Armed with self-righteous conviction, the true believers are prepared to go all lengths to remake the world in their image. By fire and sword, and later the 3 Gs that would define revolutionary justice, the guillotine, gulag, and the gas chamber, these groups would attempt to bring about a radically new social order. The revolution in France opened up a new wave of distinctly secular utopianism, a phenomenon that attests to the persistence in history of communistic dreams and their ever-accompanying themes of sexuality and violence. The Marquis de Sade and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are 2 well-known Frenchmen whose personal lives of sexual promiscuity and abandonment or even violence, as in the case of de Sade, toward women anticipate the overall tenor of the Jacobin Revolution. Both of these thinkers gave philosophical exposition to their perverse personal desires for libertinism and a new social order to sanctify it. The revolutionary mentality opened up a flood of sex crimes and violence against women and girls. Part of the reason for this was due to the breakdown of the family, which, along with religion, social mores, and tradition, was subverted by the revolutionaries. In addition to the well-known reign of terror were the atrocities, especially sexual ones, committed by the common man. Man's lowest side was not only permitted to rear its ugly head, but was encouraged to do so. The thin veneer of civilization having been rudely torn away, in the language of the outspoken critic of the revolution, Edmund Burke, left man naked and shivering. Again, in the name of equality, revolutionaries unleashed rapacious desires for social leveling. In Vendée and eastern Brittany, General Walter's infernal columns massacred the population of entire villages. Girls and women of all ages were raped, from 3 years old to the elderly. In Le Mans, the Republicans killed everyone who was unable to flee the city. Women and girls were undressed, raped, killed, and then placed in obscene postures next to the naked male corpses, and even the corpses were then raped. Crimes against women and children are almost always committed during times of war, but the important point to remember when reflecting on these particularly outrageous sexual crimes is of the Jacobin Revolution, like the Bolshevik Revolution, was that these were not war crimes as such, but were war crimes going by the name of virtue, a particularly dangerous phenomenon that would continue into communism of the 20th century. While it is impossible to unravel fully the complexities that define us as human beings, it is clear from the preceding portraits that there exists within us the desire at some level for a dreamy and abstract, free and equal society. This desire is primarily motivated, deep down, by fear and envy, and driven by a will to power, which can always find expression when equality is the goal. As a certain disillusioned French revolutionary put it just before dying by his own hands, "Be my brother, or I'll kill you." Marxism-Leninism, then, would appear less like a novel and noble aspiration and more like its historical predecessors, following similarly violent logic. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx calls for the abolition of the family, and he criticizes the modern family as a bourgeois construct that will naturally wither away under communism. He argues that children are exploited by their parents, and husbands and wives are joined only for commercial reasons. Children must be emancipated from their loving but ignorant parents and educated socially so that the interest of the community will then be foremost. Women must similarly be liberated from the patriarchal bourgeois order in which they are mere instruments of production, and part of this liberation naturally will entail the communality of women. Moreover, it is important to note that according to Marxist theory, capitalism actually serves to bring about communism because advanced industrial societies destroy traditional family and community. When these social bonds are torn asunder, it's easy for the state to exert total control, as the private groups and associations are traditionally those orders of society that mount resistance to such control. Nations or communities that have not been exposed to capitalism and the destruction of the traditional community wrought by industrialization must be exploded by other means. Thus, in pre-industrial Russia and especially Central Asia, the Soviets launched their campaign by going to that element of traditional society that holds it all together, the women. The opening shot came when the Bolshevik dictator issued the decree on family on December 31st, 1918, in which the state replaced the church's legal role in issuing marriage certificates and conducting weddings, and it also eased divorce laws. Then in 1926, the Bolsheviks promulgated another family code, which further simplified divorce, requiring neither the consent nor even the knowledge of the other party. The breakdown of the traditional family was crucial for the Soviets. The hope was that in transferring marriage from the church to the state and easing divorce laws, the institution of marriage would be rendered impotent and would naturally wither away. The result of these decrees was rampant divorce and subsequent remarriages, abandoned women and children, an increase in infidelity and rape, and the spread of venereal disease at epidemic levels. Systemic excesses stemming from communist ideology and enshrined in its legislation at the top had their counterparts at the grassroots. Just after the revolution, a decree on the nationalization of women was issued in a couple of cities. In the city of Yekaterinodar, and a similar decree was issued in the city of Saratov. The decree from Saratov declared that, quote, "the private ownership of women ages 17 to 32 is hereby abolished," and, quote, "become the property of the people. Women who failed to comply with their summoning or forcible rape were to be denounced." The decree stated, quote, "all men have the right, no more frequently than 3 times a week, to utilize one woman within a 3-hour period while adhering to the conditions spelled out below." So turning now to the particular historical example of Soviet Central Asia will help lay bare the ugly reality of the Soviet objectives. The operation in Central Asia provides a striking and clear example of exactly how Soviet subversion, deception, and propaganda operation worked to attempt to destroy the old community and supplant it with monolithic Soviet rule. Within Muslim culture, the ties among family members was particularly strong, with the women completely dependent on and subjugated to their husbands. This provided a double opportunity to the Soviets. Removing women from their traditional role in society would not only weaken the bonds that would allow state power to grow, but would also create social chaos as age-old taboos were questioned and violated. Moreover, the Soviets could conduct their operation in Central Asia with impunity, even praise, as it is difficult to find women more in need of so-called liberation than Muslim women, subjugated to their husband's rule, which is sanctioned by harsh Islamic law. Once again, though, Soviet ideology ran up against the realities of human nature, and as always, the result was calamitous. Gregory Massel's book, The Surrogate Proletariat, does an excellent job of unpacking the complex situation of Soviet rule in Central Asia as it pertained to women. He points out that the Soviets viewed women as, quote, a potentially deviant and hence subversive stratum susceptible to militant appeal. By exploiting this weak point in society, it was believed that conflict could be roused, leaving an opening for a Soviet takeover. Massel sees the Soviet project to emancipate women in Muslim culture as conscious and deliberate social engineering. The Soviets, in order to remove the old ruling power, which would certainly serve as a source of opposition to their rule, killed the Muslim elites and instated their reign by force and terror. The women were the purported beneficiaries of the new Soviet rule, but the only demographic to really welcome the liberators were the most poor and oppressed. Women were encouraged to work in factories and attend literacy and other cultural classes, which were little more than Soviet indoctrination. And then finally, they were encouraged to remove their veils. This last act, which was staged as public demonstrations set up by the Soviets, resulted in untold horrors for the women. The backlash from the Muslim community was harsh. In Uzbekistan, between 1927 and 1929, around 2,000 women were murdered, many of whom were subsequently mutilated and desecrated for unveiling during the Soviet campaign. In Turkmenistan, since the veils were not worn, women were murdered for joining the party, seeking divorce, and other violations of gender norms. Women were thrown out on the street, many were even murdered by their husband and kinsmen for bringing shame, either real or imagined, on the family. The Soviet regime was wholly unprepared to support the masses of women who unveiled, with the result that many were left destitute on the streets. Many of the women who once supported their so-called liberation were forced to confront the bleak reality of the situation and return to their traditional roots. For all of the oppression, the real oppression that these women faced in traditional Muslim society, it was apparently a situation that was preferable to the one created by the Soviets. Rhetoric about the emancipation of women provided a convenient cover for the real Soviet goal, total and unlimited power. At worst, as modern scholarship still testifies, Soviets would be accused of failing in their goal to help women. The results of their efforts at women's liberation on all fronts in Russia and Central Asia were undeniably disastrous. Yet rarely is the case made that the Soviets had absolutely no intention of bettering the lot for women. There was a refusal on the part of scholarship to acknowledge the great tragedy for women that was their so-called emancipation. It is a disservice to women, especially those who suffered terribly under Soviet rule, to refuse to acknowledge the truth. Some feminist scholars on the topic so distort the reality of the situation as to suggest, quote, as one author put it, quote, many party activists, prompted by women's entrance into the workforce, enthusiastically took up the cause of daycare, socializing dining, and women's liberation from household responsibilities. One can only wonder what, other than communist propaganda, could have given this particular author such an impression of life in the Soviet Union. One would be hard-pressed to find an authentic account of a party activist in the 1930s who willingly acted as a babysitter or a cook for a female peasant or factory worker. Soviet sympathizing feminists suffer from a type of schizophrenia, wanting to pardon the Soviets for their noble and progressive attitude toward women, but unable to ignore the obvious imperialism toward Central Asia. On the one hand, women must be liberated from traditional oppressive patriarchal Muslim society, but on the other hand, such interference in another culture would constitute intolerance. And moreover, women must be recognized as a distinct social group requiring certain, that is, special, rights and services not required by men. Thus, the solution for many feminists or otherwise postmodern scholars is to ignore the fact that the Soviets were only interested in the aggrandizement of power and to analyze in great detail women's employment numbers, legal codes toward women in the family, numbers of women in party ranks, and other statistical and demographic information, which is all of dubious validity as the Soviets are notorious for fabricating numbers. It is our duty to recognize the Soviet operation for what it was, so that in the future, regardless of particular context, we will view liberators more skeptically, and we will see through the smokescreens of political rhetoric. Human beings are ethically dualistic, divided between higher and lower potentialities. We must always be on guard against the ever-present inclination toward aggrandizement and power. As history has shown, so-called liberators often only want to impose their own rule. The most oppressed, as was made evident in the case of Muslim women in Central Asia, are chosen as the most in need of liberation. It is easy to argue that oppressive practices, such as those practiced against women in Muslim cultures, must be stopped. And certainly, when the dignity of the human being is violated, these practices ought to be stopped. However, human nature always stubbornly resists its own manipulation and transformation. The complex reality of the situation does not permit instant liberation, whatever that may mean in the concrete, and it's something that could be hotly debated. Rarely do the oppressed emerge from their liberation in better positions than before. More often than not, they are left in worse positions, as was illustrated in the case of the emancipation of women in Central Asia and certainly also in Russia. It was almost always the case that the erstwhile liberators, having stirred the pot and produced further disaster for the oppressed, flee the scene and blame the backward and recalcitrant society for failing to adopt their progressive measures. We must not exonerate these groups that disguise their own will to power with rhetoric about liberation and brotherhood. History has testified to the true nature of these operations time and again, and it's time that we see them for what they are. Just felt like that was relevant.
Thank you very much. The way it works, I usually provide a short comment, and then we take a couple of questions. You will all be able to torment Emily when we have our lunch break or snack break very soon. At any rate, what we're looking at here is a spectrum of continuity. There is a heresy called Gnosticism, which, although Middle Eastern origin, eventually influenced Judaism and Christianity and would emerge in various forms and in various civilizations, preaching a very similar gospel, namely, hey, I'm smart, you're stupid. Follow me, I'll take you to paradise. By the way, if I should like, I don't know, animals, then I have sex with animals because I'm smart. If I like women, then it is women and they should obey me. It is, within those sects, it was always about control. But it was also about chaos. More chaos, more destruction of the order that the smart ones opposed. In many ways, women were crucial. The free spirit groups specialized in targeting the most vulnerable orphans and widows. Not only because the sectarians and Gnostics of medieval times assumed that there would be money among widows and orphans, but also because those people were the most vulnerable. And then, in medieval times, women were told, the more you sin, including by making yourself available, the more you offend Jesus and the faster he'll come back. I'm not kidding. The more you sin, the better. Naturally, Bolshevism was a brand of Gnostic heresy, but they secularized all of this. They kicked out the spiritual and religious messages. But they attempted to do the same thing. Foment a revolution, destroy traditional structures, and take advantage of human beings, women in particular, while promising liberation. The operation that Emily described in Central Asia had only one purpose: to destroy the traditional structure of the Muslim society. Whether we like the way that Islamic societies are set up or not, it's immaterial at this point. The aim of the Bolsheviks was not to improve the lot, say, of Muslim women or Jewish women or Christian women. It was power. And one way was to say, hey, you'll be hanging out, you'll be just the most fantastic person. All you have to do is free yourself from everything you've ever been taught at home. But it was not done for the benefit of the individual. It was done so the individual would become a clog in the destructive machinery of the revolution, as Emily described. So, continuity between extremist movements, they're not even aware of this. You know, if I told you about the Anabaptists in the 16th century, Münster in 1534, who took control of Münster, and if we had a time machine, Jan van Leyden, their leader, wouldn't have known about 11th century Bogomils or 12th century Bogomils in the Balkans who had a very similar agenda. Attacks on family, private property, tradition, kill traditional elites. There are also apocalyptic elements. The West got it for the first time from the Maccabees, the Jewish survivors of the slaughter of Jewish insurgents by the Romans, who started imagining apocalyptic scenarios that the Messiah would come, destroy Rome, destroy everything, and restore righteousness. And the righteous would lead us to redemption. Anyway, those fantasies eventually emerged in a secular form. This occurred during the so-called Enlightenment, when the Gnostics invoked science, because Marx was very heavy on science. He said, look, I have a scientific formula to prove and show you where history is leading us. Whoever opposes us must be crushed by the revolution. That means even the intimate sphere, in the intimate sphere, one was supposed to demonstrate one's revolutionary commitment. You don't practice free love with 50 Bolsheviks. There were in some cities in Bolshevik Russia, during the revolution and its aftermath, the civil war, there were roundups of girls. There would be an order issued by a commissar, let's catch some girls in the park, because they like, high schoolers like to stroll there, and they round up girls. We have, I think, we found evidence in one place, but nobody really has studied it, because it's so ugly. Nobody wants to look at this side of the revolution. Everybody thinks, here's a quote when I was an assistant in the Western civilization class at Columbia University. We had a visiting professor from Italy, and she said, the revolution was an exhilarating experience for everyone. She was really excited about the revolution in France. And then a student piped up, even for Marie Antoinette, there were victims, ladies and gentlemen, and there were more victims and on very, very many more levels than anybody can possibly imagine. And Emily is a pioneer. I'm really impressed by this, because this is virgin land. Nobody has touched it. And I would encourage feminist scholarship to look at the lot of women. As Professor Petrarca, whom I assisted at Columbia, was waxing lyrical about the revolution in France. I said, what about the mass rapes in the Vendée? And she said, when you have to break an egg when you want to make an omelet. Really? And then we are left, as we see in post-communism, with having to make an aquarium out of fish soup. Because somebody had a fantasy to make us all free, and then kill us all too. Anyway, 2 questions, please. Mother.
Thank you. This was very thought-provoking, and I applaud you, and certainly some of your earlier cartoons, if you'd go back to them, I think that they'd be, well, the one where the two rights where the women have to put out for the men, right?
Yes.
I think that's amazing.
Every woman
that
should
really-
do her part.
Right. So you talk about this as history and the liberating of women, and then I fast forward to today, and I'm asking you if you see, when you read this and then you think about today and part of the justification for us going into, let's say, Afghanistan was to liberate the women. This is the first time I've seen this, and I thought, is there something?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think the connection can be made on multiple levels, not just to liberate women, right, but to democratize and to liberate them politically speaking, morally. You know, there's America the Virtuous. There's a certain, this is a perennial aspect of human nature. I can only surmise based on, you know, an historical account, and I think today there's a misperception that the notion of democratizing or liberating women, or, you know, because the situation is rather drab in these nations, that we have a moral sanction to do it. But it's, as I suggested in the paper, important to look beyond that rhetoric to what's actually happening in the concrete. What does that liberation look like? Are these women actually being made better off? You know, for me it comes down to a certain epistemological assumptions, which is that you can't just decree in the abstract laws on parchment. That's not really going to take effect in a society. It has to be something that's historically developed. The people have to embody notions of respect for women, free elections, you know, all of these ideals that Americans embody. It's not just because we have it written in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution, it's because we actually historically have embodied it, and it's something we inherited over a long, you know, British tradition. It goes way back, it's a classical tradition. And so these countries that haven't adopted that, us going there and saying, here it is, you know, I have John Locke's second treatise, or here is your new constitution, it's just not, it's gonna be violent probably more than anything else, and just disrupt a way of life without replacing it with something else, would be my personal opinion on that.
If I may chime in, you would be surprised if you looked at pictures from the 40s, 50s, and 60s in Afghanistan. You would be surprised. Find pictures, graduation pictures. This is when the person in power was a reactionary king who was really mellow, and he thought his girls should learn incrementally. Teachers were respected even at the village level. Then they became communist agitators. So the teachers were one of the first to be killed by the Mujahideen in the 1980s. There was a mullah in a village in Afghanistan and a secular teacher. And if a girl or a boy showed promise, they were sent to Kabul. And you have classes with people dressed the European way, just like in Egypt. You would be shocked. Conservative monarchies, not reactionary monarchies like in Saudi Arabia, but conservative monarchies were understood they needed to modernize slowly so that nobody was offended. The moment you introduce speed and revolutionary change, the law of unintended consequences means mass slaughter and resistance. Now we have the Taliban, so we're back. Thank you very much. Compliments of the progressives and Soviets and others. We're back in the 14th century in Afghanistan. There had been progress made. There were women engineers. One of the greatest, pardon my French, bastards in the Afghani insurgency, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, whom I have been watching since the mid-80s when I volunteered to fight in Afghanistan, back when I was young and beautiful. So I really studied it because I wanted to know what I would get myself into. I was in college, boys are stupid. Anyway, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar started his career by throwing acid in women's faces. However, this was in the late 60s, early 70s. The king and his police went after people like that ruthlessly. So Gulbuddin Hekmatyar then joined a Maoist fraction. He was involved with the Maoists. Eventually, he morphed himself and became one of the Mujahideen commanders when the Soviets invaded. But people like that were not tolerated. This was not considered acceptable, sexy, or anything. And the king's police took care of it, just like the Shah's Savak. And I don't like the Savak, but I prefer the Shah over Ayatollah Khomeini anytime in Iran. Is this their way? Do I like it at all? No, this is not my system. But I'm not Persian. I'm not Afghani. I wish basically all the people well, but I would be extremely reluctant in imposing by force certain ways on certain people. It should be incremental. And the elite must understand the need for modernization in an evolutionary manner, because then it becomes natural. And as I said, women doctors, women engineers, and nobody was really bothered. Once in a blue moon, you had a freak, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who is a really bad guy until this very day in Afghanistan. But otherwise, it worked out.